Good morning, Lawless, and welcome back, fellow armchair generals. This is Gamer1745 here with my continuing playthrough of Hearts of Iron 3 with Black Ice 9.11, and we're in the Pacific War now. We really are. Okay. Quick summary. We've taken the island of Oahu with, I would say, no major losses. I mean, there were losses, and at least one pocket battleship was lost, and oh man, well, let's just, we can illustrate here. We've jumped up to reinforcements of 89, and that is mostly for capital ship and other ship repairs. Just a few are still stationed out here, but we spread the load out around. These are in pretty good shape. They didn't even go to the battle, because I forget where I sent them all. Soyu is down to 49%, and they're already coming back. But we can see here 14% for Zuikaku and Junyo by the end down here in truck. Okay, no, we didn't get anybody over there. Okay, CAGs are coming back pretty good. Let's look at the carrier base fleets. I want to... Actually, they're looking fairly well. Okay, so we have here... I mean, they lost all but one of their destroyers. I'm sure I had 4 more destroyers with that group. There they have a bunch of destroyers. Looks like all the CAGs are more or less still there. Oh, no, that lost one. Because that I think the Hiru should be a 2 CAG group. Don't know. Not sure. Oh, that's just where we were. And we did look at, that's the Wakaga and the Akagi. They're, like I said, pretty good shape. The Shokaku, they're in a fair shape, so it's looks like mostly the Zuikaku is group that took the worst hammering. I don't think I lost a carrier. I know none popped up in the what's lost in naval battles, but we were also being hit by a lot of bombers, so it's possible something and I just missing it, but they look all here, which we're really glad about. Okay, now we're going to invade Wewak, I think, next, because that has an air base. Probably not a big one, but we can come in there, and then we'll move over to Rubal, I think. So we've got no, this coastal battleship group is going to come down here and pound the coast for the invasion, as well as being a loose escort. I'm moving out the Yamato group here with their to be ready. These guys are getting pounded a bit with the Hong Kong garrison, but they look like they're going to pound themselves in their counterattack. But we're going to be offshore to push into there. And we're pushing down Malaya. We're pushing into Burma. So yeah. Oh, let's also go take a look at what's going on in Europe. I haven't looked yet this session. Okay, so Germany is down. If you remember before, Germany had Narva. Okay, so the Soviets have counterattacked and taken back Narva, but the Germans had, I think, had this, but then were pushed back out. This Spakov. Buy some vowels, people. Buy some vowels. They're not that expensive to put in your words. But they pushed into there. Looks like this is fairly deeper. And yeah, this is sort of about where it was. I think they pushed a little bit more into the Pripyat marshes. I don't know what happened up here. Well, obviously they got pushed back, but what? There was a big stack. Where did it go? No, those look like reasonable garrison type. Got from events. Some self-propelled artillery pieces that it doesn't know what to do with. But yeah, oh well. Now see these guys here, they all shattered on attacks. Probably due to winter conditions. I really don't like that. I've had, and some of that yearly adjustment is sort of, I think, is addressing mine and other people's concerns. I can see the possibility of some Japanese units are not shattering on attack. Because I'm presuming these are attack, and there's 11 infantry divisions in there, as I can see. Looks like maybe 13 divisions all told in this stack that's wrecked. The wrecked one, there's also looks like another division. Well, no, one of the 11. This guy's just sitting there. Because most divisions are going to lose organization by the time they get down to 50% of the strength that they started the battle with. For most nations, and that includes Waffen SS. Take the Leibstandarte or any other, die-hard group. Now on defense, that'd be a different matter. I could see some of the SS groups taking pretty heavy losses and other things, but I'm going to guess that those were done in attacking and shattered, and I don't know. That could be what had happened, but I don't know up there. And of course, it could have just been, hey, yeah, the Narva front was like really cool, but we wanted to come down and fight some partisans and maybe turn over divisions to the Serbs some more. Yeah, could be that. Could be. Croats get divisions from the Italians. I don't know. Yeah, okay. Well, wow, the Finns are pushing back the Germans. Maybe that was it. Because these guys look like they're about ready to be cut off. Because this is a... Yeah, once if the Finns take this province, this whole stack will be cut off. Wow. And this could, well, yeah, maybe it was them attacking and get shattered. I don't know. Yeah, okay. But hey, and we are pushing back into here, along with some others. To hold there. Okay, that's a good summary of what's going on. And I'm shifting a bunch of air to here. Now naval air here that we're going to speed up a little bit more. Singapore guns, okay. So, well, oh, and I want to thank, I actually have it up here, Joseph and Spartans, both for really good posts about Singapore, and particularly Joseph, who is from Singapore and who studies it in school, about Percival and stuff. And I really thought some of Joseph's stuff that essentially Percival was a very good staff officer, second in command kind of guy, who would follow orders really well and achieve the goals of the orders really well. And I don't mean follow orders as like, off the cliff, but, and which is sort of what Joseph sort of alluded to, that he was Percival was told to fight a war of attrition. I'm presuming this is in the latter days of the campaign in Malaya, and just hold out in Singapore. And he chose not to do so. And I tend to agree that fighting a war of attrition, you know, of holding and, you know, fight house by house or block by block or whatever in Singapore, probably wouldn't have been a good idea, because we can look at it, and I quite honestly don't know how bad it was, though I know it was bad for everybody, but particularly for you know, Anglo types, for occupation, including, and even more so, I think it was even worse, but I don't know if it was worse, but I think it was worse for the Anglos in Hong Kong. But we also know the Japanese butcher all kinds of people. We have them doing bayonet practice on live Indian prisoners, you know, and other things that they really wanted to get their young men used to stabbing people, so they would tie men to you know, poles, like sort of like short telephone poles or something like that, and then have multiple men do, you know, one after the other against an alive person and stab them to death, and to sort of get them used to killing people. So yeah, the Japanese were bad too, and this is not you know, you come across a wounded guy in a trench, and back in I think it was the 70s or very early 80s, but PBS did a sort of, I forget the guy who sort of put it on, a sort of ethics and military roundtable kind of thing, multiple episodes, and I watched it several times way back. And you know, what do? You know, what's lawful, what's moral, and what not in warfare, and you're really going around with a lot of some academics, but a lot of, you know, military commanders who had commanded units in the field, including World War II and Vietnam back then. So, you know, so you come across a wounded Japanese, or a wounded enemy, let's just call it wounded enemy soldier in a trench. It's perfectly legit to stick a bayonet into him, because he might pull out a hand grenade and kill you. He might have a gun hidden on him. He might be just unconscious and wake up and find a gun and start shooting you in the back because you're busy doing something else. And if you come over the, you know, you launch into the trench and everybody puts their hands up, it's perfectly legit to shoot them, because you do not have to take their surrender. Okay? They could have surrendered long before you were coming over the lip of the trench. But because you're coming in there, you may be alone. You know, you may be a Sergeant York. Now, Sergeant York takes a huge number of prisoners only after he sort of successfully does it and realizes that he's alone. And he has basically an officer, you know, with a gun to his head. But he doesn't have enough bullets to shoot everybody, so he has to take them prisoner, and so he takes a huge number of people prisoner. But if you're just, and particularly earlier on in the whole campaign, if you watch, and I think it's a fairly good reenactment in the Sergeant York movie. You know, he's killing the first groups of people he's doing without offering any surrender, because he can't. You know, because you can't take prisoners. One guy, well, if there's just one bad guy and there's one of you guys, and you know you can immediately from where you are decide to walk them back to your front line, you can take them prisoner. But if your mission is to say get to a bunker to put a grenade through the slit, and you come across a guy huddling scared in a, you know, on the bottom of another, you know, shell hole, you've got to put a bullet into him, because you can't turn your back on him and go put a grenade through the slit of the firing machine gun, because you've got to save your buddies and possibly your own life. So you've got to kill this guy who's just, you know, an emotional wreck and is just, you know, is crying and whatever. You've got to kill him to save your own life, because he may, you don't know this, and he may or may not, he may come sort of to his senses, oh my God, I could kill that guy and save my own buddies, or something like that. So you've got to you don't have to accept a surrender. Okay, and they talk about this in the Ethics in War. I remember some of the Green Berets that were, or other special forces type, maybe they were Rangers or something, operating in northern Iraq during our invasion there. They did when the Turks blocked the main U.S. troops from coming south out of Turkey, which really is in my opinion, the first step of Turkey leaving NATO. There was a UN, and I don't know how Turkey voted in the original UN agreement, but there was a UN agreement that for a war against Iraq, and the U.S. went to war to kick out the Iraqis out of Kuwait, and then there was, a ceasefire agreement, and it is absolutely clear that on many multiple occasions, in many different ways, Iraq had broken the ceasefire agreement. Now, did we have to invade them again? No, but we chose to. We thought they had weapons of mass destruction. You can look into how, one particularly an Iraqi defector who was very much sort of a high level, so I call him a defector, who was anti-Saddam Hussein, who was in a position to know some of these things, lies to American intelligence to get them to take out Saddam Hussein. So they were lied to. They chose to believe it because it's what they thought was the case. They say, Bush lied, people died. No. Bush said something that was untrue, but he believed it at the time. Okay. But so we thought they had weapons of mass destruction. That was another. But they had targeted the aircraft that were flying over the no-fly zone. They had poison gas people in the north and people in the south, which was against the ceasefire agreement that the Iraqis signed. They didn't have to sign. We could continue to bomb them, but to stop us bombing them, they signed a ceasefire agreement. They broke it. We had the U.S. government had every international right to reinvade Iraq. And so a NATO partner refuses troop movements through their country. They're a member of NATO, they're a member of the UN, and this is a UN-approved action. Maybe the UN wouldn't have later voted for continuation, but they had already signed they had already approved the agreement, Okay, so, and they hadn't made a specific vote to revoke U.S. international right to invade Iraq if they break the ceasefire. I mean, that's basically what they did, and they broke the ceasefire, so the U.S. eventually reinvades. Don't sign a peace treaty if you're not willing to keep it. Just I know there's no world leaders here, but maybe one of you out there who will watch me one day will become a world leader. Either keep fighting or don't quibble over a detail. Maybe there's something that's just unacceptable, but don't sign it if you or you may get re-attacked. But okay, so Turkey keeps the big divisions from moving south, which hurts the quickness of getting the war over, because the U.S. is not able to quickly round up and disarm large groups of Iraqis. So that, I think, contributes significantly, not the only thing, but a significant contribution to the second phase of the Iraq War, the sort of resistance movements to the U.S. occupation. The first phase, the sort of mission done banner that was really more for the carrier than anything else, that Bush talked in front of, and people went on for years about, but was really the sort of initial overthrow of the government, and that worked very well. They didn't get the top leaders, including Saddam Hussein, for a long time, including his sons, which were running the government, and enough of the people faded away. Part of that was the lack of a northern, front. But they did put in some Rangers and Green Berets and whatnot up there. And there was at least one case in which there was one or more embedded reporter with one of these groups. And the Special Forces group engage an Iraqi unit. Doesn't really matter what Iraqi unit. And the Iraqi soldiers, oh hell, we're being ambushed or whatever, and start running away, and just running as fast as they could away from them. And the reporters just about almost started to attack the U.S. soldiers, like trying to knock their weapons out of hand, because U.S. soldiers were just shooting the guys in the back as they were running away. Those guys hadn't surrendered. They're running away to fight again another day. It's not, and see, this is what a lot of reporters just don't understand war, and they're being embedded as war reporters. These aren't guys. Well, does every reporter need to understand war? No, if your job is to report on celebrity gossip and other news, no, you don't need to understand war, but you're being embedded with U.S. troops going into a war zone, you should probably do so. And so they were shooting at combatant soldiers who may have dropped their weapons, but were actively running away. They didn't stop and put their hands up. They didn't, surrender. They were running away. So the Americans were shooting them in the back as they fled so that they wouldn't have to shoot them again and, be shot at another day by those same soldiers. That is all legit warfare as we currently understand the rules. Now, maybe 5 minutes from now or 100 years from now, they may change the rules of war. And yes, Japan was not a signature to the Hague Convention at the time, or something, the pre-Geneva Convention kind of thing. But so we're not talking about that. We're not talking about somebody shoots out of a window at a Japanese unit or whatever, and the Japanese rush in and just kill everybody in the building because they don't know who the guy that shot them, and they must all be guerrillas, and so this is just sort of units overreacting. No, these are prisoners, months, weeks, maybe even years after they're taken prisoner. They're tied to poles, and they're used as bayonet practice while they're alive. See, that is a war crime, and this isn't, oh, well, it was just the SS did it. The common German soldier didn't do it. No, this is the common Japanese soldier. When this is in Germany, this is Japan. This has not been tagged to some special elite imperial death unit. It was just different units doing this. I'm not saying every unit did it everywhere, but this was a relatively common practice with prisoners of war. Oh, and they also did it to Europeans too. So there was lots of butchery going on. And so, get back to Percival. He thinks by surrendering the city, he's going to be able to get relatively decent terms. And he probably was under that delusion. And I don't mean it necessarily that he self-deluded himself. He just may have thought, we're Europeans. We're better than those nameless millions of Chinese out there. And how dare the Japanese would never do it to the sort of European middle-class peoples that are populating Singapore and other places. But yes, the Japanese do so. The Japanese had really grown in arrogancy, and this happened well before the start of the Pacific War. I don't know if it's like Mukden incident or whatever else. They were really growing this arrogancy of dealing with not just with Europeans but with everybody. And okay, you're here. We want you to come up here because I'm seeing that fighters. No, you're not rebasing. You are coming up for air interception to this area, so go intercept somebody. But so he did definitely thinking that he's protecting the lives, property of the civilian populace of Singapore, and so he rejects the order to fight an attritional war with the Japanese, which in the short term might have gone okay, because like I say, the Japanese were almost entirely out of ammunition by the time they've sort of gotten to Singapore. Yes, and as Joseph said, there was some hard fighting over at least some of the reservoirs that were more up on the mainland or something at the time. He makes a very good thing about the battleships that had been sunk. Had they been kept in harbor or, under the general protection of this sort of area, they could have been used as counter battery fire and just general fire, as well as the ability to maneuver around and sink any invasion barges coming onto Singapore. And unlike him, and this is why I'm taking everything that he's saying as basically true, because he lives there and understands it. Because I know that if I lived in, and he does say he's very much a history buff, if I lived in an area where there was a singularly important battle, I would know it inside out. you know, so had they had some proper ships still around, they probably could have used that to protect the island. And he agrees with me that he was the wrong man at the wrong time, follows orders reasonably so, and found the attrition order wrong. But I think Joseph and where Spartans make some other good points too. And like I say, I am not an expert on all of this, so I am not saying I am right and any one of these people are wrong by any means. But Spartan really looks at the idea that a lot of the troops from Australia and New Zealand that had recently landed had been really green, really like untrained, and I don't know, quite honestly, I don't know the conditions of their training. I can't make any good comment other on how well they were trained, because you can, just generally speaking, not about those specific troops, you can have troops that have gone through basic training and they know how to march, they know how to salute, they know how to dig a foxhole, they know how to shoot a rifle, sort of know how to do a practice on a bayonet charge field, sort of know how to do the basics, and that's it. And then they're like, oh, these 30 guys. Now sometimes it may be the training, but often it's not, but I don't know in the Australian system. Sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. The platoon you go through training with may or may not be the platoon. I think maybe more so in the British and the Commonwealth system. The platoon that you're going through on the training becomes your platoon in actual fact. But I also know that a lot of times you put people through basic training and then they go off to their actual fighting units. So you very well maybe have newly formed, platoons, companies, battalions, brigades, divisions, all the way up. All this is all new formation. And so you've got 30 guys or so in your platoon that you don't know who these guys are. The lieutenant doesn't know any of his people. The sergeant may be a good sergeant who had previously been a corporal somewhere, but hadn't been an actual platoon sergeant or whatever. But he's a long time serving guy, where the lieutenant's probably not a long time serving guy. And so but the sergeant hasn't whipped his little platoon into shape, and so you've got a collection of strangers that don't know how to fight together. They're not a unit yet. They're just a collection of individuals. Say when I call your name, line up over here, kind of thing. Okay, now you're a platoon or a company. You know what I mean. And so they're not a unit. So you may have guys that have gone through basic training and had not been properly formed into units in the sense of training together. Or maybe they hadn't even completed basic training yet. I don't know. But still, with all of that, I would have, so I'm agreeing with Joseph that it was a bad idea, or, to try to do an attrition campaign. But even, I'm sort of disagreeing with Spartans, that it still would have been worth a really good, solid counterattack attempt that would have cost lives of his troops. I don't know if it would have cost significantly more lives than would have already been lost to, which he doesn't know, but to prisoner of war and other abuse kind of situations going on. A counterattack would have been advisable, which is, of course, different than what London was ordering. And I'm getting some of this from Joseph's statement. He was saying that they were ordering a war of attrition here. Wrong commander in the wrong place. And there are really good people that are really good executive officers, whether of ships or of units, and are really good at that, or which isn't necessarily a staff officer. Executive officer is different than a staff officer, but because staff officers, but I'm talking executive officer like a combat unit, so you're actually a combat leader, and somebody but there's also really good staff officers too. But a really good executive officer, and a really good officer commanding units under close supervision. Meaning that, yes, they're commanding and operating the unit, but they're not given, shall we say, independent commands or independent commissions, because they just don't think that way. And then there are other people, and they actually have personality tests nowadays for some of this stuff. There's other people out there that make a fairly poor executive officer, make a fairly poor standard officer, but make an acceptable level one. Can do the job, gets reasonable marks, does a reasonably good job, doesn't stand out. But when they test the personalities, because they've learned how to do some of this stuff, and I can't tell you what or how, test the personalities, because they've also studied the personalities of other people, would make a great independent commander. I mean, an outstanding one. I'm thinking of little guy with beard, British. Man, I keep blanking on names. Maybe I'm just getting old. Wingate, sort of special forces commander or whatnot of Orville, if I'm remembering right, Orville Wingate. Short guy, probably in a pith helmet, at least the pictures I've seen, beard, a general. Somebody like him, or somebody who's sort of an outside of the box thinker and a bit of an unconventional guy, not like a guy that's necessarily, bad personality, but just, might not stand out in a standard British regimental system and just sort of be okay, but put him on whether a large scale operation or a small scale operation, he's an out of the box creative thinker and a really good independent commander. And nowadays they try to through personality tests to try to find this out. Back then they didn't know this, how to do that stuff. So sometimes you have people that will really shine in other circumstances, but not in a sort of the standard ones. So yeah, wrong sort of person. I'm guessing that with what looks to be a theater commander here, which I would have kept back here, just because you don't need them near the front, and this was Singapore's guns, we are about ready to hit the Singapore garrison here and overrun it. Because good. These are heavy guns. These aren't railway guns. Yeah, but mostly these just improve certain types of combat. Okay, and we're also breaking out here. I used the Marine units to support the attacks on these other formations. So that they can get ready to go somewhere else. Okay, periscopes have advanced. Very good. Not sure if that means they're just harder to see, or no, grayed out, or if they can see better through them. Submarine torpedo. That looks like a good benefit. No, Italy. We're repairing all of our ships. Okay, so now we've got a bunch of air here. They're going to come and naval strike this whole area in case there's any returning group. We're going to let them actually sort of organize up a... Well, I don't want to totally... Yeah, big area. Naval strike anything operating out there. Okay. They've given up their assault. Okay, let's immediately go in for the attack, because hopefully... Let's go connect you to a more local commander. Against units that are now much worse shape. Good. Okay. Well, we tangled with some British down here. Oh, it looks like we've got I can't quite read what that... The Queen? QE or QUE or something? Or battleship name? Queen Elizabeth or something? I don't know. Okay, so we've won there. We're across the river here, good. They're coming here. And yeah, I'm fully aware that just because I can win here doesn't mean that this is what would have happened historically. But it is in my mind showing some of the possibilities that could have happened. If you know what I mean, yes, and I always go for the 4,000. Because these are possible. Things that people possibly could have done, you know, deployment of troops and things like that. Some of the stuff is ridiculous, like moving your heavy guns out of Singapore alone. Those are only going to be effective. Mostly effective when stacked with something else. They really should actually be part of a unit, not just in a... Well, not just stacked, but actually part of another unit to be properly effective. Okay, submarine torpedo tubes has advanced. Okay, and that is grayed out. Electro class boats. First, because these are expensive to build. Doesn't mean we're not going to build them, but let's first get these going. What was the other? Yeah, okay, just standard submarine class improvements. Oh, yeah, we'll do the electro boats as well, because that's from the Bank of International Settlement. It got us a little bit of a boost there. And maybe also taking some other things like Hawaii. Damage control would be nice. And we got half of one more. Let's see if we can find a 42 AA control systems. Good. And yeah. Okay, now we have coming what up to here. Are they here yet? No. They are here heading north. I know I was talking a lot. I did want to talk more about Percival because I think it's an important topic. Because I look, again, I want to come back to here. Okay, I've read some of it being historical fiction. Good historical fiction keeps, I mean, one, it's good to read, but good historical fiction is, and sometimes it's sort of hard to, one author, Douglas Riemann, also wrote under a different name. When he's writing in World War II, I think he's fairly good historical fiction. But when he jumped back to the 18th century, I really enjoyed some of his first books, but this was sort of early when I was reading sort of Napoleonic era wooden ships historical fiction. He eventually was inventing small islands in the Mediterranean and other places. You know, whole islands to set up his sort of story. And I just, at that point, I stopped reading any of his books. Later on, when I did some more research on him, did read some of his World War II historical fiction, because it seems to be better rooted in history. But even there, I would say it's just fair. But we have like Dewey Lambden, or look over my shelf here, Dudley Pope particularly, but also Dewey Lambden is probably one of the more historical. And of course you have the Horatio Hornblowers by it's Alexander Kent. Don't read Alexander Kent books. I have some on my shelf. Most I read from the library when I was reading. Oh man, why am I blanking so much today on things I know? Oh, Forrester. The author of the Hornblower series. Those are pretty good. Those were written actually during World War II, mostly in America, because he wasn't, I don't think, of an age to really be fighting in any of the wars. Sort of exiled himself to America to get out of the war, but was obviously very concerned about Britain and was writing stories. And so Hornblower is sort of stories written for people in the English-speaking world, but British and others, but sort of dealing, set in the Napoleonic era. So he's, in my opinion, the founder of sort of modern historical fiction, but in many ways. But sort of, in a way, dealing with what was going on in World War II, because that's sort of when he was writing, but wanted to write about the earlier stuff. Patrick O'Brien is another one, a good one for good history, and Richard Woodman is another one for good history. A good history, or a good historical fiction, will take the history that was going on and weave in a few characters, a few other things, to move through that history and show you and talk about the history. And very good historical fiction will get the attitudes of the people correct for the period. And so, like we see with the Horatio Hornblower character, he really very much is the sensibilities of a sort of a middle-class 20th century person in the late 18th century. And sort of his reaction to what, though generally speaking he gets the age right, the age of the Napoleonic era right, that is correct. But it's sort of this sort of hero that we in the 20th century can relate to, that world, the corruption, the bribery, the whatnot going on, sort of our sensibilities looking at that, as opposed to what would probably be a hero of the time reacting to it. So it's very good. I love Hornblower. It's very well written, very good, but it's not very good historical fiction. It is good historical fiction. There is a difference, like I say. So very good. You get Dewey Lambden, I would say, is a very good historical fiction writer. But so some of the stuff I've gotten from historical fiction, and I try to some degree curate the authors, and as I've look at this is over like a 20+ year history of reading some historical fiction stuff. I got early on, it was just more for the stories, but I got realizing that I wanted to learn about, I always wanted to learn about history, but I don't want to be polluted with, shall we say, romance novel history, if you will, in that that's a thing that is set somewhat in the past, and sometimes very accurately in the past, sometimes not very accurately in the past, but just sort of stuff to tell a story set in the past, to take it out of this and that kind of thing. I don't want to pollute myself with ideas, with mistaken ideas about the past. I guess I should say, it's not some sort of religious, or I don't mean it as in God and that, but I don't want to, not that pollute myself with bad thoughts. No, it's not that, but I don't want to get the wrong impression of people of 18th century English viewpoint. Okay, what the English, generally speaking, people thought of the world and how they interacted and how they spoke and all that kind of stuff. Now I might get what the Englishmen thought of this, what the Spaniards were in the 18th century, which may be an inaccurate view of the Spaniards, but it is a relatively accurate view of what the English thought of the Spaniards. It may be a caricature of that, and that's fine with me, because I can learn the English attitude of it. Now, if at some point find something that's palatable to read, that is set in the 18th century, Spanish, military or naval type historical fiction, I think I would love to read it, so long as it needs to be relatively translated into English, and to see but somebody who's done the research and knows the attitudes of Spain, they had a much, shall we say, stronger class system than in Britain, and accurately, not to have, which is often the point is, with the sort of just okay, you might have a Spanish communist writing historical fiction set in the past that tears apart the past because they're judging it from their anti-class viewpoint, that classes are bad things, and we should all be leveled and all this stuff. And so I wouldn't want to read that, because that would tell me more about the author than it does tell me about the past, if you know what I mean about that. I was one time started reading, I think I may, because I bought it used, still have the book somewhere, but a book on 18th century Britain. Well, I got about a quarter of the way into it, and I realized that the author was a Marxist. And it's not like, oh, he had a Marxist, I like Marx on, his, his wall or something like that. No, and I don't even know that the guy was a communist. He might be. But his whole view of 18th century Britain and the whole view of looking at that was through economics. Peoples were motivated by economics. And this is a type of view that has infected, in my opinion, historical research. And in some cases by people that are, vehemently anti-Marxist when you come to communism and whatever else. But they've got this viewpoint that, well, why do they do these things? Because it economically benefits them. That's the Marxist view of the world, as opposed to religion motivating them, or localism, or actually another big thing, and I don't think Americans understand this, and I don't even know how much Australians do. I think just some bit. I know I have some Australian viewers, and in some ways Australia is very much like America, and New Zealand and Canada in some ways very much like us, in some ways very much not, still within the general world of Anglo culture, but so it's not like extremely different, but so relate to some things. But how much class identification informs who you are in Britain? Most Americans don't understand it, and in Britain, to some degree, if you start talking differently, if you were, a lot of Americans think sort of the Liverpool accent is the American accent because of the Beatles or something. But if you moved from, say, a Liverpool accent, a heavy Liverpool accent, and you started to talk like a, not necessarily you've gone to like Oxford or Cambridge or anything, but you start talking more like a middle class, just sort of middle class type Londoner or something, and then you go back home to your neighborhood and you keep that sort of other accent, you're going to be seen as a group traitor to a large extent. And so it's not just the toffs or whoever, I'm trying to use some of their terms, are looking down on us. There is that, but it's also this sort of group identity that is, and yeah, I learned about this both living there and watching various media, that if you try to move out of your sort of birth situation, try to move up, you're often seen as a climber by the people that you're moving up, and the people that you're moving away from, you're seen as a traitor to some degree. even if you want to help the old neighborhood, even if whatever, you're sort of seen as somebody that's sort of rejecting them. Where in America, there is so little of that, you can't hardly imagine how little of it. If you go to the Hamptons or somewhere, you know, old money New York, and they don't have the accents like you think of a you know, New York accent, sort of the upper class there. That is such a small clique of people, a percentage of people within America, that you know, sort of let in because you are so rich. People like Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg or whoever, but not even really ever them, because they're not of it. There is this small sort of clique of class elites. But even to a degree, to a large degree, though, you'll never be one of them, but you'll be another elite, because we in America recognize a meritocracy and recognizing bettering yourself from the situation in which you started in. So climbing, so long as it is not done by stepping on people, if you will, meaning you're forging your own path, you're not tearing down somebody else, is quite acceptable in America, where it isn't in Britain to this day. And now, again, from my outsider's view, and who has never been to Australia, where I have many times been to Britain, I see sort of a duopoly or whatever of sort of the Australian viewpoint, and then the small, I've heard it's about a 10 or 20%, and it may be fading more and more, and presumably it will continue to fade as time goes on, but a 10 or 20% sort of wannabe British, not necessarily an elite, because they're not necessarily like in power or anything, but want to sort of keep their Britishness while living in Australia, and that's sort of a bit of a separation, though I don't know if it's continuing or fading or much known anymore. But back in the past, that was sort of a thing in Australia, and not just the idea of some Britons living in Australia, but multi-generational people living in Australia, maintaining their sort of Britishness while living out in Australia. And that's sort of what I see from there. But outside of that sort of divide, I see Australia as mostly a classless. I don't mean not classy people, but not with a general sort of class divide between the elites and the non-elites. It's more on if you get political power, or if you become a star in the, you know, TV or media, or if you have money or whatever, you're a member of the elites, but you don't look down as somehow lesser of the people. And that's in some of the ways I identify with Australia, plus the idea that Australia is another rugged individualist type country like America, at least was, and still in large sections still is. But we have been infected by many recent mass waves from different parts of the world that don't have the rugged individualist trait. And if you look at can be sort of fairly rugged but not individualist viewpoints out of some of the cities of like New York and Chicago and whatnot, that had large immigrant populations coming in from Central Europe, and they didn't have that viewpoint, and that is causing us some problems. It's that conflict. See, we have a lot of conflicts in America, and a lot of them really aren't to do with race, because notice I'm not talking, you know, some of these are very much from Europe, but where most of my ancestors that I know of, including the ones that were here before the American Revolution, as well as the ones that came to the United States around 1900, the last groups of them, all generally lived rurally. Now, I mean, not say they didn't go to cities, but they didn't move to a Chicago or New York. They moved to Maine or Virginia or Kentucky or you know, sort of, and they weren't necessarily farmers. because one of the ones I know lived very rurally in Maine, owned like a business, a store of some sort or something like that. You know, so you know, to the best of my knowledge, in that generation or whatever, never went out and farmed a field in his life, and probably, you know, would be at a loss to. But he was a person living rurally and owned, you know, small, you know, before anybody thinks being rich or something. No, just owning a small business up in Maine, which is cold, and I wouldn't want to live there, being a Californian. But, you know, so it's that kind of, you know, kind of thing. So my family ancestry is more with that American ideal, if you will, than an urbanite. Something goes wrong, call the person to come and fix it idea, I guess, would be a good way to do it. Whether it's a plumber or an electrician or a whatever. No, you fix it yourself, unless it's a really big problem. You just fix it yourself. You just do it. And that is what I think, and this is what when I periodically run into people that very much, you know, don't have that attitude. You know, something's wrong, you call the person to come and fix it, and he fixes it attitude. And they're not necessarily by any means rich people, you know, that is just, they're, you know, shall we say, working class type people, but it's not their profession, so they don't know how to do it. And it's how it's done is you call the professional, and even, you know, basic things. And that's part of our conflict politically, shall we say, is these sort of clashing ideas of culture and society in America. I know we've gotten off of the topic. Episode's gone on long enough. I want to thank you for watching. Thanks for liking the videos. Yeah, if you're still here and you haven't subscribed, you better, because if you made it this far. And of course, I would love to hear you on any of the topics that inspire you to comment. Thanks so much. See you next time. Let me save this quickly here before I hit the button. It's probably gone to, oh no, close. I want to let the clock go, because I've had problems that if I've talked too long and don't have the clock go, and then I immediately try to save, it will crash. Or if I just let the clock go a little bit like that, and it crashed. No, I didn't do that well enough. Well, that means I'm going to have to go back and replay some of this. Okay, thanks so much.